very uplifting and inspiring period of worship that we have had. Now we continue with our examination of the Word of God, another expression of our worship. We completed the book of Leviticus, and we now move into the book of Numbers, so named because there was a numbering of the people during this period. A census taken at the beginning of the book, and then another taken at the end of the book. Do you remember the book opens and they're still encamped at Mount Sinai? But they strike camp and head toward their second and ultimate destination. They're headed toward the land of Canaan, the promised land. Well, you remember they assemble a reconnaissance team in chapter 13, one individual from each of the 12 tribes, leading individuals, leading men. And you remember how then they sent these men out. Moses instructed them to go forth and to reconnoiter the land of Canaan. And they do so, and they remain gone for over a month. And they travel up through the confines of the land of Canaan, the promised land, the land of Palestine. And they return after that 40-year period, and they stand before the nation to deliver the report, which the Bible describes as evil or bad. That is, it lacked faith and ultimate accuracy as far as what God had expected from them. But here is the report. They said this land of Canaan is everything God said it would be. They even used the Hebrew idiom, a land that flows with milk and honey. That is, it's sumptuous, it's bountiful, it would easily care for the needs of the population. 10 of the 12 spies then said, but there's no way we can conquer this land. There's already standing militaries, well-fortified cities with high walls. There are even children of Anak, the Anakim. These were people that were genetically giants. They said, we look like grasshoppers in our own eyes, let alone theirs. But can you imagine the reaction of the people? And Caleb stepped up to the plate, wasn't it, and said, fellas, or people, God has told us to go in and conquer this land. We are well capable of doing so. Let us go up at once and take it. But chapter 14, there followed an entire night of national mourning. The people stayed up all night, weeping and wailing. Their nationalistic dreams, which they had entertained for centuries, completely dashed. And by morning, they were ready to select new leaders and to return to Egypt and place themselves once again under Egyptian subjugation. Could you imagine that? They said, at least there we ate good. See, there is an indication of how we allow our physical desires, even legitimate needs, to override and overshadow the spiritual needs of our lives. Well, once again, Joshua stepped up and urged the people to do exactly what God said. He and Caleb were standing together on this. And do you know the people they entertained intentions of stoning those two fellows. Just execute them, get them out of the way. They disagree with the majority view. That's when God said, enough of this. He told the few faithful, Joshua, Caleb, stand over to the side, and I'll just put an end to this whole bunch right now. You know, I'm confident in some of these congregations of our brethren that have swallowed a distorted, perverted view of grace. They don't study these passages. They don't preach on these passages because they depict a different God from the God that they have painted, a distorted misrepresentation of God himself. God was ready to eliminate the adult population and to start over because of this unbelief, this incessant resistance and rejection of God's will. This is so powerful for us today. We need to constantly shape and mold our spirits by reminding ourselves of these fabulous truths and incidents that occurred so long ago. Well, do you remember Moses intervened? That shook Moses up that God would wipe out the nation, so he pleaded with God. You know, he was the intermediary between the nation and God, and so he pleaded with God to pardon them, forgive them for this infraction, and God said, okay, I will pardon them, but not one adult that was involved in this conspiracy against me will be permitted to go into the promised land, but will in fact wander around aimlessly in this desert for 1 year for every day they were in the land. 40 years. And at the end of that 40-year period, I will take their children and grandchildren into the land. The very children that they thought, if they went ahead and tried to conquer the land, that they thought, oh, we'll be attacked and our kids will be plundered and so forth. No, they're going to go in. But the mamas and daddies and grandparents, you're not going in. And look at this principle of life. The children are going to have to wander around in this desert for 40 years and bear the brunt of your disobedience. See, children suffer the consequences of their parents' sin. Think of all the people in the United States this morning that are not worshiping God according to Christian teaching. Did you know the statistics are dismal? Less than 40% of Americans even go to church anymore. Okay, what is happening to their children? Oh, they never even hear the name of God unless it's used in vain. They don't know anything about the stories of the Bible and God's teaching. How long can a nation endure that kind of ignorance? So children suffer. Think of the parents that take drugs and smoke meth and stuff. Their children are suffering. Is God pleased with that? No. But don't blame God for that. God has set up life in such a way that people can make proper decisions. They exercise free will. God can't interfere with our free will. That would turn us into robots. We've got to decide where we want to spend eternity. And when we choose poorly, people around us are hurt. Such is the nature, the devastating effects of sin. Well, do you remember they finally got the point and decided to go ahead and go in, and God said, don't do it. Don't do it. It's too late. And they did, and a number died from that. You know, as you continue reading through the book of Numbers, you get, by the way, a depiction of life in the church. You thought about that? Acts 7, where Peter delivered that great speech, talked about the Israelites at this point as being the congregation in the wilderness, the church in the wilderness. So see, they had come out of Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea. Well, we came out of the bondage of sin and we crossed the waters of baptism. We then enter into the church. And one day we hope to pass through death and enter into heaven. Many of our songs depict this as crossing Jordan. I won't have to cross Jordan alone. I stand on Jordan's stormy. That's a metaphor for death. And then we can enter into heaven. Well, in between those 2 points is life in the kingdom, life in the church, life on earth. So the book of Numbers is a great book to go to get a sense of how we as individuals can succumb to sin and the circumstances of life that try us. And you read through this book, and in that sense, it's a very depressing, a very unpleasant, one incident after another. After this situation where they, so many failed to do what God asked them to do. Come on down, for example, to chapter 16, where Korah, Dathan, and Abiram decide, you know what, we don't think that Moses and Aaron should be the only leaders of the community. We are sanctified as well. We're from important tribal groups. We ought to be allowed to exercise leadership. And that hurt Moses' feeling because he hadn't assumed leadership on his own. God had selected him. And Aaron, being his brother, was to be the first high priest of the nation. And so God, once again, he told Moses, you just, by the way, once they made that push for leadership, Moses said, all right, we'll let God settle this, so let's assemble 24 hours from now and let him do that. Well, during the intervening time period there, they got on the telephone and called all the members of the church and convinced everybody to side with them. I've seen that kind of thing happen in the Lord's church. And so by the next day, they were all assembled against Moses and Aaron. You know what God said? Count how many times he does this. Moses, Aaron, you fellows get out of the way. Well, I'll just put an end to this whole bunch right now. Astounding. Once again, Moses interceded, begged God. He said, okay, then tell everybody to get away from the tents, the homes, and the families of those ringleaders that instigated this. And you can just imagine the people kind of moseying and not being in any big hurry until the ground started vibrating and fissures started opening up. And I mean, people began running and screaming and yelling at that point. And the Bible says that the ground opened up and swallowed the tents of Kor, Dathan, and Abiram and all of those family members that sided with them. There's another lesson from the Bible. What means more to you? Water or blood? According to the Bible, water's thicker than blood. Your Christian family, those who have passed through the waters of baptism, ought to be of greater import and ultimate loyalty than your own family. Doesn't the Bible teach that? Jesus said, if you love your mother, father, son, or daughter more than me, you are not worthy of me. Well, did God create the home? He did. And are we not to have certain responsibilities and loyalties in our fleshly families? We are. But God and his spiritual families to take precedence. And when push comes to shove, you better choose right. There were family members that died along with Kor and Dathan and Abiram because they sided with them. Well, another incident occurred a few chapters later, chapter 21. Numbers is riddled with this sort of thing. Do you remember there we're informed that they were traveling through a particularly arid, rugged region of the Sinai Peninsula. That's really where they're wandering around even to this day. It's a hard place to even think about living. And they become discouraged. The text says the soul of the people became discouraged. That's not sinful. God knows that we are human, we're frail. We become discouraged. We have ups and downs. Our framework, our psychological framework, we have emotions that get down at times and so forth. That's understandable. But what do we do with that discouragement? Well, they began blaming God and blaming Moses, bringing him out there and all that kind of stuff. Now that's turned to grumbling, murmuring, complaining, which the New Testament says we are not to do. Neither let us murmur, as so many of them murmured, 1 Corinthians 10. So look what God did on this occasion. He sent poisonous, venomous snakes among the people who began to be bitten, and many of them began to die. And it's only when they had a change of heart, they repented, begged Moses to intercede on their behalf that God might remove this great plague of snakes. And do you know God instead provided an antidote? You remember he ordered Moses to construct a pole with a bronze serpent, a bronze snake wrapped around it, and to position it in a specific location in the encampment for those who wish to be relieved from the effects of the snake bites to go to that location and be healed. He did not remove the snakes. Now apply that to our day. We will do things in our lives that will bring hardship and anguish upon ourselves. It's not up to God to remove that, particularly when we brought it about. But there's always forgiveness available. There's the antidote. John indicates this was a prefiguring of Jesus suspended on a pole between heaven and earth and offered on our behalf. Incredibly, when you get to the book of Kings, that pole and that snake were still being carried in the community. And they began worshiping it as a snake god, called it Nehushtan. That's something how we human beings are. Well, you proceed on through the book of Numbers. You come to, like, for example, chapter 25, where they've finished wandering through the desert, and now they've gone up and they've crossed through the land of Moab and Ammon, and they're moving up and getting poised on the east side of the Jordan River in preparation for that next generation to cross the Jordan and go into the promised land, Palestine proper. And in chapter 25, as they're traveling through there, they encounter the Moabites. The Moabites, typically pagan people, that, and generally speaking, false religion among pagan countries then and now has involved illicit sexual activity. And so a number of their women lured Israelite men into engaging in their idolatrous activities, which included illicit sexual activity. God told Moses to assemble the nation. This is Numbers 25. And the people were gathered together, and he ordered for the instigators to be impaled, to be hung up before the people. And while they're there as a nation, as a congregation, weeping, national mourning, an Israelite man very brazenly brought a Moabite woman and kind of passed within eyesight of the congregation and headed toward his tent with this girl. And Phinehas, you remember the grandson of Aaron, or grandson, and he sees them, and I can just imagine this guy kind of looking around like, is anybody going to do anything? And so he himself follows the couple into their tent with a spear, and with one thrust of that spear, he impaled both the man and the woman, which tells you something about the position that they were in. Now, you and I would be horrified at such a circumstance, would we not? But do you know what God said about Phinehas? He gets it. He's like me. See, Phinehas held that sinful activity in holy horror. Remember how Paul put it in Romans 12? Abhor that which is evil. Abhor it. And cling to that which is good. Well, God used the word jealous, zealous. Our English words try to capture the concept there of having such an intense devotion for right and God that that's ultimately what matters in life. And God said, this fellow, he understands who I am. And he has, in fact, offered atonement because a plague had started creeping through the congregation because of the sin, and it stayed it. These are eye-opening passages that I guarantee you the liberal element in the church, they dismiss that. They don't want a God like that. They don't want to have anything to do with such a God. That's certainly the attitude of the atheist, the unbelieving world. Well, we need to do a careful assessment of the principles that are being taught here and see that this is not ungodlike. This is not inappropriate. It depends upon how we view life and what life is about. And by the way, how temporary this life is and where we're headed. This life is going to be over in no time. And we're going to step into eternity. And all that will matter is how dedicated, how much we loved God. And we're willing to adjust our lifestyles. Well, you come to the end of this book, and there's another census. Sometimes sit down and put the first census and the second census side by side and take a look. It's unbelievable how many thousands, hundreds of thousands, had died off, and the younger generation had grown up and were now ready to go in and take the promised land. So we turn to Deuteronomy. That word means second law. It's from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, just like Numbers is arithmoi. And it's called Deuteronomy because the law of Moses that had been given 40 years earlier is now being restated. Because you see, you have a whole new generation of young people that have grown up. Well, think about it. If you were born during that 40-year period of desert meandering, the oldest you would be 40. And so the older generation had pretty much died off. These people now, the adult population, would have held memories of Egypt and the 10 plagues and all that. Those would have been childhood memories. And so here they are, ready to go in and take the promised land. Well, God's attitude is you got to restate. You got to reindoctrinate people. Every generation. I know my parents, the World War II generation, were deeply disheartened at how many of us baby boomers turned away from God and Christ and the church and American values. in the 60s. That was a shock to them. And that's where the church began to go off to the left. And look how many liberal churches now occupy our country that have abandoned basic Bible principles and teaching. Truly tragic. So each generation has to be taught. And so Deuteronomy is designed to do that. And it's designed to tell them how to go in and take the promised land and be successful and to sustain their national existence there indefinitely. And you know what the formula is for doing that? What would you think it would be? Well, we got to have a strong economy. And we need to provide health care for everybody. And we need to provide education for everybody. The state needs to pay for that. And we need to have a strong military. Those don't have anything to do with the keys to national success. God said, here's what you need. And it's the same formula he restates over and over through this book. First of all, the adult population has got to get their act together and do what I tell them to do and set the right example. And then, number two, you've got to get the younger people, the adolescent population, to fall into line with those same principles. That's exactly what our country needs today. If we could go stand in both houses of Congress and say, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to give you today the keys to national success that will enable America to be the most prosperous, successful country on the planet. And here it is. All of you men and women need to stop all your drinking and fornicating and all the other stuff you're doing out of harmony with God's will and get your act together and get in right with the one true God. And then you need to set the example before your children and before all the children of this nation to urge them to do the same. They wouldn't even let you go in there and say that, let alone stay there if you started saying it. They'd laugh you out of there so fast. But God cuts through the thicket of confusion that we humans like to throw up to, throw dirt in the air in order to cause us to not be able to see clearly. But God sees clearly. The way for any nation to be successful is for the adult population to get close to God and then to require their children to do the same. It's that simple. Look at chapter, 7, where he says, here he is talking to the nation. What country has the right God like we do? And what nation has the right law? Came right from the mind of that God. This is a great nation. We're going to make it. There's the attitude. And all through that book, you have that stressed over and over and over. Come down toward the end, you remember, and God tells Moses, you're not going to be permitted to go into the promised land because you allowed the people to goad you into disobedience. Remember when he struck that rock and he was supposed to speak to it? And do you remember the expression God used there? Same thing he had told Moses at Nadab and Abihu's deaths. You failed to hallow me, to show me to be the holy God that I am. See, when people disobey God, that's what they're doing. They're disrespecting, dishonoring God. They're failing to show him to be holy, like they don't care. Or flippant about pleasing him and wanting to conform to his will. And so he said, you will not be permitted to go in, but I'll allow you to look at it. And so you remember he went up and looked across and saw a portion of it. And then the Bible indicates he died and was buried at the age of 120 at a grave site known only to God. That's interesting. We then move into the book of Joshua, where his understudy and successor takes over the reins of the nation. Look at God's speech to him in chapter 1, beginning of verse 9. 3 times he says the same thing. God only needs to say something once, but he repeats it. You need to be strong. He's not talking about physical strength. He's talking about spiritual stamina, spiritual determination to stay with God and do what he wants you to do. Don't be afraid. Be courageous. Well, these are the things that need to be said to the church, the leaders of the church today. They need to be said to all of us as Christians, because we're out here in the world, we're seeing all this stuff's happening to us. It's easy to get disheartened and feel uneasy and, oh no, am I going to be able to make it financially? A lot of different things that come our way constantly in life. And we may be tempted to not even go to church. I've known people who had tragic things happen in their lives. And their attitude was to blame God. And they said, well, I'm not going back to church if that's how it's going to be. Well, that's the opposite of what a person ought to do. The more life presses in upon you, and you and I experience what everybody experiences. Suffering and hardship and death is the common lot of everybody. The Bible teaches that. God doesn't promise us longevity, like we'll be immortal and never die. Well, He does, but not in this body. So we're all leaving this body. We're all entering into eternity. So when life gets tough and we start feeling uneasy and discouraged, that's when we ought to turn to God. That's when we ought to be more faithful, more dedicated, more determined to fill our lives with spiritual things like those which we get in the assembly and beyond. Well, that's what He was telling Joshua. You've got a task before you, the military assault of the land of Canaan. And I mean, they instigated it in chapter 6, and you remember their first military target they conquered by simply marching around it for 7 days. What military target in all of human history was ever conquered or captured by such a fashion? But there you go. When God's your military commander, it's certainly possible. Do you know at the founding of our country, there were many times that our founding fathers believed, they fully believed that God's providence was manifested in various battles? Like the time that Washington was backed up against a body of water by the British warships, and they were about to be massacred, and by evening a mist had settled down, blocking their sight from the British, and he spent all night getting the military across that body of water, and the next morning when the British were ready to attack, they were gone. You know what the founder said about that? That was God did that for us. Now, you can disagree with them or believe them. I'm just simply telling you what they said. And they said that about a number of incidents. Come on, here were thousands and thousands of seasoned British troops that came to fight our little ragtag, thrown together group of militiamen. They were the most powerful military force on the planet, and we whipped them. The founder said there's no way that could have happened without the intervention of God. They gave God the credit for that. I guess we'll find out in eternity whether they were right. Well, Joshua launched that attack in chapter 7 against that first military target. They conquered that country, or that city. And then they proceeded to move to their next military target. There you remember Ai, smaller town. They said, we don't need the whole military. Probably 2,000 or 3,000 men will do it. They go into battle, and they are whipped and run in retreat. Joshua falls down on his face before God and wants to know what in the world is going on here. And God said, get up from there. Don't blame me for this. He said, there's sin in the camp. You've gone directly against what I've told you to do, and you'd better ferret it out or you're not going to be successful. And so they began bringing tribe by tribe. The guilty party wouldn't speak up. So they tribe by tribe cast lots, narrowed it down to one tribe, family clan by family clan, narrowed it down to one family, worked through there, came to a man by the name of Achan. He said, okay, I did it. You know, that first military objective, they were to take all of the booty and dedicate it to God. And he had taken some. It was an article of clothing, Babylonian garment, and a couple of wedges of gold, and buried it in his tent. And when he finally fessed up to it, Joshua sent somebody to retrieve the stolen items and brought them back, and then had he and those of his family that sided with him stoned to death. Stoned to death. From then on, they were successful. And as you read through these chapters, they commence a military incursion to the southern portion of Palestine, instigating what we would call sorties, lightning raids against major urban areas. Then when they mopped that up, they swept to the north and took all of those major cities. They had agreed, with God's approval, to allow 2.5 of the 12 tribes to have their tribal lands east of the Jordan River, the Transjordanic land areas. But they were to participate in the military assault of Canaan proper, which they did. When you come to chapter 22, they've completed the objective for the most part. They left some resisting elements there that they should not have left, which came back to haunt them in the period of the Judges. But they had done pretty good, and so Joshua gathers the leadership of the nation. And delivers some remarks to them. And then in chapter 24, gathers the whole nation to deliver his farewell address. He's retiring, and so he delivers his final remarks to the nation. You remember it's in that speech, verse 24, where he says, "Choose you this day whom you are going to serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." They said, "We will too." And he said, "I don't think you're going to be able to do it, because God will not put up with incessant disobedience and violation of his will." And that was prophetic, because when you move into the period of the Judges, you move into the dark ages of Jewish history. And it's a very dismal, tragic book. It describes about 300 years of Israelite life in Palestine. The very last verse pretty much describes it. Everyone did that which was right in his own eyes. The cycle that's described in chapters 1 and 2 give you kind of an outline of the book. God's people would go off into apostasy, usually idolatry or something like that, and he would use one of these remaining pockets of pagans, usually the Philistines, to come in and punish them for their lack of spiritual devotion to God. They'd finally have enough of that, and they would cry out to God, and he would send them a deliverer, translated in our English versions, judge. But the Shophatim were not really judicial figures. Deborah did some of that, but they were really military leaders whose singular assigned task was to throw off the shackles of oppression instigated by the Philistines or whoever and free the people up where they could once again be devoted to God. And it wasn't very long before they'd go right back into apostasy. So that cycle about every, I would say 30 to 60 years would just repeat itself several times throughout the book. And we're introduced to a whole string of these judge figures, some really great ones like Jephthah and others, and we won't stop and deal with all that. But what about Samson? Four chapters, 5 chapters devoted to him. If you were living then, if you were living today, I'm sure he would be making movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Big muscles, probably shiny oil on him and everything. About the strongest man who lived, but the Bible depicts him as about the weakest. Well, why would God use such a weak man that began telling his parents, "Oh, I like that girl, get her for me"? She was not even a Jewess. She was a Philistine. And then he went through a string of women, finally got a hold of one he couldn't handle, right? That resulted in his eyes being gouged out and made a slave for the rest of his life. Well, why would God hold him up as some sort of a national leader? Well, because they had an assigned responsibility. You are to inflict casualties against the enemies of God in order to free the people up from their bondage. That's it. And so these individuals were not always themselves paragons of spiritual strength by any means. No wonder then in his last ditch effort of his life, when he brought down that structure, the text makes this odd statement. He killed more in that incident than he did in his whole life. Well, that's kind of a callous, odd remark, isn't it? Unless it's bringing you back to the theme of the book, which indicates these individuals were assigned by God that task. He fulfilled that task. And that's surely why he's mentioned in Hebrews 11, not because he possessed a robust faith that is fleshed out with spiritual devotion, but because he did what God told him to do. Hebrews 11 shows us the nature of faith. It's an obedient faith that complies with God's will. Well, that book closes, again, very dismal and very upsetting circumstances where, this book is replete. It sounded more and more like America. There's homosexuality. There's all kinds of sexual sin. There's bloodshed. Remember that horrible situation where this fellow, his wife, the word concubine is a term in antiquity that refers to a wife of lower birth. She is literally sexually assaulted to the point that he kills her. Does it sound more like America? And so he takes her and cuts her up into 12 pieces and ships each piece to one of the tribes. How would you like to be the UPS driver on that delivery? And why would he do such a horrible, sadistic sort of thing? He's trying to rally the country to take vengeance upon what has taken place here. And you remember toward the end there, the Benjaminites get at odds with others, and there's a bunch of Israelites that are killed in that mess. It's horrible. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. It was a period of spiritual darkness and depravity. But when we come to the book of 1 Samuel in our final session, we'll see things improving and a light at the end of the tunnel. Well, God's book was written for our learning so that we might learn from it and learn to be faithful to God and living the Christian life. Maybe you're not a Christian and you need to obey the gospel through faith, repentance, confession, water immersion. Or as a Christian, maybe you need to come before the church and acknowledge sin in your life that needs to be rectified publicly in order to devote yourself continually and faithfully to God's will. If you need to obey the gospel, we urge you to do it as we stand and sing.
Jesus is tender.